I built a few companies and sold a few companies. The last company was Victors and Spoils, which was an ad agency based on crowdsourcing principles. And we started as an idea. Fortunately, the New York Times ran a half-page article about us, and that night we had 700 people sign up for the crowd, and Dish Network, the television network in the U.S., gave us all their advertising. So we were off and running. And a few months later, about 18 months later, I sold the company to Havas, out of France, which is a big advertising holding company. And our vision, David Jones, the CEO of Havas, and myself, our vision was to make Havas, with 20,000 people, a crowdsourced company. That's where I met Kareem and Mike Tushman and Jen from the Laboratory of Innovation Science at Harvard. They did 2 case studies on us, one on being born open at Victors and Spoils, and the other on can an open system, a new open system, affect an old closed or incumbent system. What we found is it doesn't work. I became chief innovation officer, and I could not, even though David and I had a great vision of what we wanted to do, how we wanted to change this incumbent organization, especially a French incumbent organization, we were unable to do that. We found that the middle layer of the 400 CEOs across the globe inside Havas were just a brick wall that we couldn't get through. When we first did our work, and Mike's done a lot of work around identity and ambidexterity, around incentives and ambidexterity, a lot of his academic papers, we thought it was about the incentives. Maybe we made a mistake incentivizing folks the wrong way at those 400 CEOs. But what we realized, it's really an identity issue. And I think that's the thing that I've really been interested in when I joined Harvard as executive in residence and at not only Harvard Business School, but also at the Laboratory of Innovation Sciences at Harvard. Really interested in how do we overcome that incumbent thinking, the adoption issue, because we've seen so much great work at NASA that you guys have been doing, and so many great tools we talked about today, but yet there's still a lack of adoption. So how do we overcome that? Those are the things we're trying to think about at the lab. So the Laboratory of Innovation Sciences was started a couple years ago by Kareem Lakhani, and it actually sits between the business school and the medical school and the computer science department. A really interesting mashup at Harvard. Gives a lot of power to the thinking. And the mission, really, or what we're doing is spurring the development of the science of innovation through a systematic program of solving real-world innovation challenges while simultaneously conducting rigorous field-based social science research. A lot of things we've been thinking about are how can we do experiments that can prove the efficacy and the economics of open systems. Does it work economically? What is the innovation? How does it really work? What are the benefits? The 6 areas we're really focused on are crowdsourcing and open innovation, data science and AI development, the science of sciences, R&D organizations, technology transfer, open software, or open source software initiative, and the business of sports. But really our main focus historically has been crowd and open innovation. Before LISH, there was the NASA Tournament Lab that Steve talked about, and also the Crowd Innovation Lab, and those were kind of the seeds for the Laboratory of Innovation Sciences. Now we have 30 researchers working in these areas, but again, primarily in the crowd and open innovation space. This summer, we had the opportunity to bring a bunch of folks together to Harvard to a thing we called the Crowd Academy, a bunch of academics globally, the leaders in the demand side and also the supply side. Really amazing, 80 participants. It was the first time that all these organizations got together. The curriculum was piloted for an online crowdsourcing course. That was really the momentum and the reason for the event. And we created the Innovation Science Guide. So if you go to the LISH website, you can see the Innovation Science Guide, which is really a follow-up to the workshop, and it's a repository of all the white papers in this space. So please, if you get a chance, go there, and you can find a lot of good academic research there. And next month, we're going to have a crowd platform meeting out in Mozilla in the Valley. Again, bringing together 20 or 30 of the best platforms, biggest platforms, to talk about what they need, how do they scale, what are the best practices, create some momentum. So the lessons learned are lots of things we talked about today. I'll be brief. Obviously better, faster, cheaper. Culture is first. The cultural barriers are those inside the organization, like I talked about with Havas. Consistent knowledge is important, and common language, those two go together. One of the things we're finding is we're in the cycle, and this happened at VNS, it happened 10 years ago when I was working on another company called Radar, when we were working in the co-creation space and working with Jeff on writing the crowdsourcing book. But everybody has their own language around open and crowdsourcing. Some people call it crowdsourcing, some people call it open innovation, some people call it co-creation, and there's a lot of confusion, right? So especially for incumbent organizations that are trying to adopt this, we've got to be way more consistent as an industry and find a way to talk about this that's less threatening, that's less about disruption, innovation, and transformation, and more about enabling the current teams internally to scale and become superhuman. That's a term I've heard a lot lately in the conferences I've gone to. There's a sphere of adoption, like we talked about, this innovation, transformation, and disruption. They're scary. They're scary for people at the mid-manager level, like at Havas, and really that's the place that seems to be the tension and the friction that we're trying to solve for. So one of the things that's happening that you'll see in the next couple months, Jen Pike and Jeff Davis, who Steve mentioned, who is one of the founders of the NASA program, is coming up with is coming up with a hub, which is called Creating the Centers of Excellence paper, to talk about the guidelines of what it took to go from NASA from the 7.5 years to actually doing that same thing, scaling a practice inside an organization in 3 years. We still think there's a way to go, so the next paper, follow-up paper, is how do we take that goal of 3 years down to 3 months. Open Assembly was born out of LISH. I've started a bunch of companies, a publishing company that I sold to Condé Nast, that really we got the ideas in the 80s to start doing co-creation and worked around that. Radar Communications, which was a strategy company based on co-creation. I wrote a few books about co-creation then. And then sold that to an ad agency called Crispin Porter Bogusky. It was interesting. Who was the guy talking about the Domino's? Jeff. Yeah, Jeff. It was actually our team at Crispin that came up with that whole, your pizza sucks. And the idea really was there that, it was really a shift. And I think that's one of the things we need to think about in this whole space, is that one of the things that Domino's was stuck on when we started working with them is they had a history of success with this 30-minute guarantee, that Jeff talked about, right? It was, you're going to get your pizza in 30 minutes. And the company internally couldn't get over that. And I think some of the language issues we talk about as an industry, we get stuck on language. And one of the things we try to convince Domino's, instead of saying 30 minutes or less, because they couldn't anymore legally, we flipped it to, you've got 30 minutes, right? So giving the consumer 30 minutes to get ready, and then we created an online platform or tool that connected into the POS system to see when the pizza was going to arrive. So essentially saying the same thing in a different way that was really powerful. And part of that effort was really to be radically transparent, to allow the brand to talk about what was really happening in an honest way that was aligned with consumers. And I think that's what we need to figure out here. We're talking a lot about really great tools, really great technologies, but we're not talking about the pain inside customers on the demand side, right? The fear, the identity issues. And I think as an industry, we need to all focus on that. So we're doing a lot of, bringing together a lot of organizations and thinking about how do we broaden the context from crowdsourcing as a tool and open innovation as a tool to the human cloud, and then really it's all about the future of work. Every company and every organization needs to think about what is their future of work. Many might not use tools like blockchain or crowdsourcing, but still they need to think about it in that context. And we're trying to do a lot of research that is actually based on the LISH academic research, but as you know, a lot of the academic papers are really awesome, but they don't really relate to the demand side. So how do we take those down and then make them more useful? One of the things we've done that's coming out actually next week, we did a project with Topcoder. We're launching this Open Assembly Quarterly, Co-Creating the Future of Work. It'll be a quarterly. This is the first one. The State of Crowdsourcing Report was really co-created by a bunch of folks. Here's a list of folks from the industry that we've helped us create this. Really amazing conversation. It took a lot longer than I hoped because co-creation takes a lot longer than you hope. So you send people 25, 30-page documents and to edit everything, to get everybody in a collaborative space and do that is taking some time. But I think some really good thinking has come out. There's certainly lots of really great state of crowdsourcing reports, but as we've looked around the industry, we've seen it as they're really great sales tools for one point of view. And what we want to do is bring the whole community together and allow everybody to lean in and make something that we can use on the demand side, again, to overcome some of the fears and some of the issues with folks' identities and other issues inside organizations. Some of the insights from our first issue, certainly need to shift the mindset. If we're going to shift the language, it's about changing the mindset. Obviously, some of these things are pretty simple, especially in a crowd like this. Digital capability redefines how we work. Early stages of learning need to find common language, like we talked about. It's always culture first. I think that's one of the mistakes I made at Havas, is I went in as Chief Innovation Officer, and as the video for the case study shows, I was super frustrated because I don't speak French, and I worked for a French company in Paris that was very culturally French, and I was made the Chief Innovation Officer. I was completely an outsider. So I walked down the hall the first day of work, people were just shutting doors. You could see that very physically. So how do you get this to be, get the culture right first, get the adaptation? We're seeing the most successes come from folks that have been inside organizations for a very long time that are also mavens and can really take this and scale it and make it adaptable to cultures. One of the things I think about when we think about how we talk about language is really thinking about, crowdsourcing is awesome, but it's a tool. And somebody said earlier in the talk, I used to think about this when I launched Victors and Spoils, right? It's like crowdsourcing is awesome, but it's like a hammer, right? And so when you have a hammer, it's awesome at pounding in nails. It's really great at putting holes in walls. It maybe is okay at turning screws, but it's only a hammer. And when you take that perspective of it's an awesome tool, maybe there's some other tools. How does that ladder up? Where does it fit? One of the things we've been working at, Harvard owns the idea, or they claim to own the idea of the 2x2 like this. And one of the things we've been thinking a lot about is what is the future of work? We're really thinking about it in the context of the human cloud. And I think one of the issues we've had as an industry, we said, the crowd or external folks or contingent workforce is going to replace internal folks, right? There's this diametrically opposed tension there, right? Like if you work inside an organization and your space, your field is getting innovated, or there is technology that's going to change that, you're going to be out of a job. We messaged that. I've messaged that when I went into Havas. My point of view was, we're going to disrupt the industry. We're going to disrupt Havas. We're going to make it different. What I'm thinking lately is that we have to really think about it in more of a collaborative way to say that, hey, the traditional organization works really well for some things, right? And in order to make folks inside the traditional organization, we need to make them superhuman. How do we do that? We can extend it across the y-axis to freelancers, empowering more work to get done. We can turn on internal crowds to create more innovation internally. And we can also do external crowds or contests. So creating this dynamic so there's less fear of adoption, I think that's one of the big issues we face as an industry. And I think AI and blockchain face the same things. So what do we have coming up? We're doing a bunch of other research. In the winter, this winter, we're starting the co-creating the future of work. What does the future of work look like? Leaning into that human cloud idea a little bit further and taking that further. How do we build it with today's open strategies? And then building a support hub, taking Jeff Davis and Jin's work that they're doing on this paper and thinking about how do we take that 3-month build into the 3-year build into a 3-month build much faster. Platform best practices, that will be really a summary of a lot of the work we're going to do next, I guess in 3 weeks. In 3 weeks out at Mozilla to think about what are the best practices, how can we get platforms to align and use the same language, and think about what's really working inside on the demand side. How are some platforms really scaling? I feel like that's what we need to do, right? We really need to be the high tide to float all boats. The gig worker, I'm really concerned. Steve and I had a really good conversation, and I think he's been pushing the thinking about the gig worker and what's it mean. How do we get the benefits that we have in organizations? And if we don't get the benefits, if AI and blockchain and crowd really happen, and really the workforce that we've seen in all these charts become mostly contingent workers, right? Mostly folks that are freelancing. What does that mean to our social fabric? Are there going to be riots in the streets? Is it unfair to have the haves? Is it going to be more extreme from the haves and have-nots? I'm not sure, but I think it's incumbent on all of us that create technology and are in the kind of the new economy in all these really amazing technologies that have all this potential to think about the social ramifications of what we do and how we do it. It's a dialogue, I think, that's just starting, but it's incumbent on all of us in the room to really think deeply about that. Thanks, Steve, for pushing my thinking on it. And then one of the things we want to try to do is bring together on an annual basis, what are the base case studies? What's working, what's not? How are those things impacting? Not so much what's really cool about technology or what's really cool about a new methodology, but more what's really working, what's really changed and helped organizations really, create momentum. Mike and I were talking yesterday, and Mike Morris is like, wouldn't it be cool instead of saying, here's a slide for a case study on, here's the latest, figures from how much 10x performance we've gotten out of this platform or out of this program in a crowd effort. Like, well, let's take a user and make them superhuman. Who's a worker or who's somebody that's used crowds and gotten 3 promotions? Like, what's their success, right? How do we make heroes out of the demand side instead of think about heroes outside the organization? I think that's a really important pivot, right? How do we honor and celebrate the people that ask the questions instead of always honoring and celebrating the solvers? So again, how do we focus on organizations and leaders in incumbent organizations to adopt this new stuff without being so scary and threaten to their identity? So upcoming, the things that we've got on the schedule, we're building a little group. High tide rises all boats. We're calling it the collective. It's a few of us that have gotten together to try to, as a kind of a founding group, those of us have been in it a long time, to think about how do we bring the right language to bear? How do we start publishing the right stuff? How do we fill the pipeline with good information to let everybody else kind of adopt and create momentum around? So it's academics, some demand folks, and some supply folks. We've got a small founding group, about 20 folks, and as we publish that and get word out, we'll become more public about what's happening. But it's really focused on keeping the group really small right now and making sure that we have a lot of dialogue around really solving things. I think one of the things that we're trying to do is create safe spaces for exploration. Some things have worked really well, some things that haven't, but I think we as humans want to always talk about the things that work really well and not talk about the places of pain and failure. So, a safe space to do that. And at LISH, we're going to continue to do academic research. I would encourage anybody here who's got a good idea for a case study or academic research to see me or reach out to LISH. But some of the things we have coming up that we're pretty excited about is scaling centers of excellence through open innovation. That's the Jeff Davis and Jen work that's happening. The article's been written. It's just waiting to be peer reviewed and published. The economics of scalable open innovation, cost savings, and value generation at NASA. Steve's been working on that with what's that? Yeah, Lynn and Jen. So thanks for that. I think it's going to be it's really an amazing piece. We're also working with Balaji on the case study of Deloitte Pixel and looking at the economics. I think that's one of the things we need, at least at the lab. We feel like, what are the real economic savings and benefits inside incumbent organizations? How does it work? Does it really work? Are there savings? And how do we make sure that it doesn't disrupt the organization too much so that they can get to the future? And then we're also working with Genius Link on a case study right now. So, and again, I encourage everybody to, reach out if you have any ideas for case studies or research or anything. It's going to take all of us to kind of push it over the goal line here to get incumbent organizations to adopt. I think we're much stronger as a group, as a collective, all of us, than we are trying to do it individually. So, I lived my life in kind of as an athlete, surfing a lot and climbing a lot, and I always think about this is kind of my motto of how I think about things, and I think that's what we need to really encourage people and be comfortable with, right? This idea of never let a good disruption go to waste. That in that disruption, in that fear, in that pain, there's always something that's really beautiful that can be born, and space that needs to happen. I have a ranch out in Wyoming, and it was a real tragedy in 1988. I was pretty young, but we lost 700 trees in the big Yellowstone fire, and it was a real tragedy to my family. It's been in the family for a couple generations. Real disappointment to my dad, but for the first 5 years, it was really horrible. It was just all black ground. But it's amazing. 35 years later, the beauty that's come from that, all the things that we didn't even know that existed in the ecosystem have now blossomed because the old forest was dead and dying and strangled all the new things. So I always, encourage everybody to think about that. Just when you see disruption in your own lives or with technology or what you're doing, just never let it go to waste. Allow something new and beautiful to happen. Thanks for having me. Any questions? Nothing? Okay. Oh, there's one. I think the NASA folks would be more qualified to answer that. I'm not, we do research on and we help build the tools with Steve and make sure that, we identify the right platforms and then actually support them with academic research. But, those kinds of congressional questions are kind of out of my league. Steve would be the person.
Yeah,
he's
Steve and Amy, who are in the room too. Yeah, if Amy's here. Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
You've got up right now.
Mm-hmm.
And what you said when you first.
Right.
And you were an American.
Right.
Talk about the importance of trust, imagination.
Yeah.
As the engine option
Right.
to opportunity.
No, I think that's really interesting, right? I think a lot of, when I look back at the Havas relationship, I think one of the big things that caused the issue is there was an incredible misalignment between the CEO and the mid-level organization, right? And it's pretty typical. CEO is there to look into the future, to divine the path, to talk to the investors, to be the PR machine around the organization. The mid-level, those 400 CEOs are the guys that are out in the field doing the work, right? They don't want to innovate. They want to focus on how they get the work done for their clients day to day. And there's a huge gap, an intellectual gap, right? A cognitive gap between those two things. One of the things I think that caused the issue, it was the identity, was actually how the deal was perceived, right? So when I sold to VNS to David Jones, who was the CEO, he used that as an imaginative moment, right? He told his investors that we're the future. All these other organizations, WPP and IPG, are scared of the future. They don't want to touch crowdsourcing. I'm going to own crowdsourcing. I'm going to be crowdsourcing. I'm going to be the future. In the next 6 months, the stock went up by $1.2 billion. And as David said, maybe VNS was 10% of that, but that meant that, he got a 10-time return on his investment. So as CEO, he's like, that's awesome. I delivered the value to the investors, right? I told the story, I created the future, and that's what it was. Unfortunately, the mid-level finance guys were like, well, we just way overpaid for this. Where's my return on investment? My goal is to make sure that everything on the balance sheet and the income statement, equals out, and I can get a return on investment from that big investment I just made in VNS. And it was obvious that it was way before its time. And David, in the context of making it perform at 24% EBIT, which was the demands from Havas, it wasn't going to happen. So there was a lot of anger and angst at that mid-level from other CEOs and folks like that. And I think that's, when you talk about imagination to get to the future, it's really incumbent. I think what great leaders do is they tell that great story and use imagination to tell the world, the Elon Musks, the guys at Netflix, the Reed Hastings, folks like that. But the best also tell those folks internally what that story is. And there's a real alignment between internal and external vision, story, culture. And that's what accelerates things. When there's that disconnect, I think that's what the problem is, right? There's a disconnect of opportunity, of imagination, of passion, of even what the goal was. Like, why did I even do this? So, because obviously those mid-level finance guys took advantage of the stock price, right? They all got a benefit from that rise, but it didn't fit into their kind of cognitive framework for how they should think about investments.
Well, thank you, John.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you.